Thank you so much for coming. I am Judy Laird-Jacobs, the Executive Director of the Friends of the Blue Hills, and this event is sponsored by the Blue Hills Climate Action Coalition, which is a coalition of groups surrounding the Blue Hills committed to working together to address the challenges of climate change in our communities. The coalition is composed of a number of groups, and you can see them all listed on the screen. This is the last talk in the Climate Change in the Blue Hills series, which was intended to encourage people to connect on critical issues that will affect the Blue Hills and everyone who visits it. We also hope to give people tools and ways to become involved. All of the talks in the series are recorded. If you missed any, so you'll want to check out our website, friendsofthebluehills.org/climate2021, or the coalition website, which is bluehillsclimateaction.org. Now I'd like to introduce Laura Beebe. She's a Friends of the Blue Hills board member, and she will introduce you to both the Friends of the Blue Hills and our speaker, Kesseli, who also happens to be Friends of the Blue Hills board member. Laura.
Great. Thank you, Judy. And good evening to everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. A few quick notes about the Friends of the Blue Hills. We are a nonprofit organization with over 1,000 members devoted to preserving and protecting the Blue Hills Reservation's natural beauty, diverse natural habitats, and lots of recreational opportunities as well. We encourage people to protect and enjoy the Blue Hills, and a few of our current initiatives include trail maintenance. If you're interested in helping to care for the park's trails and forests, you can sign up for one of our trail maintenance events. We're bringing out small groups to help prevent erosion on the trails, remove invasives, and pick up trash. You also have now the 125-mile club. If you want to explore the park as part of a community, you can sign up for the club. Once you sign up, you can share your experiences of traveling every trail in the park and then receive a patch to celebrate your accomplishment. You can find more information about that on our website. And our Better Forest Challenge. You'll learn about a number of species today during Rick's talk to help document the species that are in the park and help provide data to improve the park management. You can participate in our Better Forest Challenge. You would sign up for iNaturalist and then join the Friends of the Blue Hills Better Forest Challenge group. You can find out again about all of these initiatives on our website, friendsofthebluehills.org, or you can always email us at info@friendsofthebluehills.org. Tonight, right now, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker. Dr. Rick Kesseli has a PhD in genetics from the University of California, Davis, and has worked at UMass Boston for 27 years. He was the chair of the biology department for the last 10 years. His research has been largely in plant population and molecular genetics, and his recent research projects have been in host pathogen interactions and in rapid evolutionary change in plants as they adapt to changing environments. He is also, very importantly, on the board of the Friends of the Blue Hills. And those of us on the board who have the pleasure of working him, think of him as the man who identifies things. Going on a walk with him in the Blue Hills is like going on a scavenger hunt. He can find and name everything: weeds, flowers, shrubs, trees, and critters too. So I know you'll love his presentation tonight, and I bet we all learned to identify at least one plant or creature from his teaching. So Rick, we're ready to learn, and you can take it away.
Hi, everybody. What Laura just said was mostly not true, at least the last part. I cannot identify everything in the forest. I do know a lot of the different things, and I get fascinated by a lot of the critters that are in there. And I'm going to tell you about 3 or 4 very fascinating critters today, just because I was asked to talk about wetlands and impact of climate. But when I start talking about wetlands, I start thinking about the things that are there, the habitats. And of course, I can't talk about all the wetlands. And so I've sort of focused it on a couple of different things. And so here's some pictures. And I told Laura and Judy that I was going to do a poll and ask which picture is not from the Blue Hills. And hopefully you probably noticed that there's one in the dead center. Whoops. back up, sorry. This one right here is not from the Blue Hills. However, since I have in the title Vernal Pools, that thing right there is a vernal pool. It's one in California, and vernal pools do have lots of common features, but the vernal pool in California doesn't look like anything like our vernal pools that we have here. And the interesting thing about vernal pools, and then I actually studied these in California lots of many years ago. And they, like the ones here, they harbor a very unique collection of critters because they have a very unusual pattern of drying and wetting and drying and wetting, which requires some very unique adaptations on the part of the organisms. It's also very neat for, you probably hear about island biogeography, like how populations that are separated with inhospitable area in between start evolving in separate directions. And so there's lots of work on that type of thing in the California vernal pools, but also there's things like that going on in the Northeast vernal pools. So anyways, I'm talking about vernal pools and wetlands. I put this is the Blue Hills map, and I put this up here because when you think about wetlands, you don't realize how prevalent they are. And there are parts of Eastern Massachusetts areas where 50% of the landscape is really covered by water or wetlands. And even looking in this picture here, it's not quite close up, but you have these maps, you can look at it. You see the big ponds and the lakes, you know, Ponkapog Pond at the bottom, Houghton's Pond. But if you look carefully, you see this, you know, all through here, this is Foul Meadow area. And you see that little insignia that's like a little blue grassy thing. And it's all over this place. I mean, this whole area, oops, right there, Foul Meadow area has wetlands. Here's the Great Cedar Swamp way over here. My pen goes kind of slowly here. But if you look throughout here, this is like Pine Brook, and this whole area here is very much wetlands. And of course, everything around Ponkapog. Lots and lots of wetlands there. So the Blue Hills themselves, and if you go out any time of the year, but particularly now, you'll get your feet wet for sure. And so I can't talk about all the wetlands, so I decided to do two things, two types. And again, there's swamps, there's ponds, there's lakes, there's riverbanks, there's all sorts of wetland type communities, and they're each quite different, but I'm only going to talk about two. And the two I'm going to talk about, one is vernal pools. And so this is a national, the heritage map for endangered species. And that is showing you the blue little stars throughout this in the Blue Hills area are certified vernal pools. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about vernal pools and more about some of the interesting critters that are there. And then the other thing I'm going to talk about, if I have time, presumably, the bog. So the bog is basically, hopefully many of you have been there. There's a boardwalk. It's a little difficult to walk right now, and I just did it. And but it goes out to Ponkapog, the pond itself, and it goes through this very extended red maple swamp and then into the bog. So I'm going to talk about these two things, the vernal pools and the bog, and just again, some of the critters there and why they're there. So start with the vernal pools. So this is a typical vernal pool that you've probably seen in the Blue Hills. And I thought one way to talk about vernal pools is just to mention there are those little stars on that last picture are certified vernal pools. There's probably lots of other vernal pools that are there that probably have some of these critters. But I thought the good way to define them here is the certification. There are lots of ways that involves a number of different things, but probably the easiest way to get a little water body, a temporary water body certified as a vernal pool, if it has one of the 6 obligate species that require vernal pools for survival. And so I've written down those 6 obligate species here. There's 4 types of mole salamanders, and I will specifically talk about those because they are really cute. And wood frog, which is the picture up in the upper right here, that's a wood frog. And then the last thing is animal species. The last animal species are these fairy shrimp. And the most common one is the one at the bottom here, Vernalis. And these 6 species all are generally classified. If you see these species in any temporary water and living there, then the state would probably certify that as a vernal pool, official vernal pool. And these species all depend on the vernal pool in quite different ways. I'm not going to talk much about the wood frog, but I'll just mention the fairy shrimp, which is kind of interesting because it's the most restricted of these. They're odd critters. First of all, you see the picture there. You might think it's upside down, but it actually swims upside down. Just ask why. The fairy shrimp, they basically hatch in the early spring, like March, early spring, March, April, like that. They basically swim around, upside down, they eat everything they can find, they mate, they lay these eggs, which are diaposing cysts, and basically die by May. That's it. And so the eggs can, over summer, dry out in these pools. And apparently some of these pools, the eggs, there's like an egg bank or a cyst bank, and they just sit there and can be there for a couple of years without getting re-inundated with water and still survive. So they are really fascinating little critters. And there's some diversity between these vernal pools. It's quite fascinating and interesting, and people have looked at that. That's all I'm going to say about those. Mostly I'm going to talk about these mole salamanders. And this is a picture of the 4 species of mole salamanders that live in Massachusetts. And of these, 3 of them are in our area. As far as I know, I don't know that the Jefferson, so the one at the top here, left, is mostly in Western Massachusetts, as far as I know. I mean, maybe it's here. I have not seen it. The other 3 can be found in this area, Eastern Massachusetts and in the Blue Hills. The interesting things about these, I mean, the blue spotted salamander right here is pretty rare, hard to find. The blue spotted salamander tends to be mostly north of us. So we're kind of at the southern range. And the Jefferson salamander is mostly south of us, and we're at sort of the northern range. And it turns out these 2 things, when they do overlap, they actually hybridize, and they produce some very interesting totally female asexual lineages that are given sort of their own species names, and they're asexual. They produce eggs, but all by themselves. So there's another story, but I can't go into it too quickly here. Of these others, the marble salamander, so the 3 of these, Jefferson, blue spotted, and the spotted, all have very similar life cycle. And it was just a month ago, less than a month ago, that these critters, basically with the thawing of the snow and a really heavy rain in sort of the end of March, they start migrating to the pools. And they basically migrate to the pools, and they go through some mating activities in these pools. There are mating dances. I've seen the spotted salamander once years ago when the competition is big enough. They really go through these elaborate dances in the pools. And one year, I don't know what it was, but maybe there was just a narrow springtime. They all came to the pool. It was really dense, and they were all doing these, crazy males swimming around each other, probably trying to entice females, whatever. Anyways, this all happens in spring, and it's pretty much done by the beginning of April. And so then they migrate back, and they live in underground, largely, certainly under leaf litter, for the rest of the year. You can almost never find them. They can be as deep as 1 meter in some places. They just find little holes, they dig down, they eat all sorts of larvae, insect things, whatever they can find in the ground, and you'll never see them again. The marble salamander has a slightly different life cycle. It's sort of similar, except instead of mating and doing all this stuff in the spring, it basically does it in the fall. So around the beginning of September, with fall rains, they're a little bit more dry adapted. So they go to the pools that are maybe a little bit wet, and they essentially lay their eggs there. And then when the rains in the fall come, the eggs hatch, and the little larvae live there for a long time, and then eventually crawl out. I can give you a little bit more of I'm going to talk a little bit more of their life cycle, because when they're larvae, they are, about salamanders. They live in the water, and they have gills at one point, and then they have lungs at another point. So when they're larvae, they're living totally underwater, and they look a little different. And I'm going to show you relatives of these. And the adults are obviously terrestrial and not aquatic, although they swim in the water, but they breathe air like you and me. So I'm going to mostly focus now, though, on the spotted salamander, because that is the one that many of you have probably seen before in this area. And so these are some cute little pictures. This is from this year. And this is the habitat on the right, where you see them in these little vernal ponds. And it turns out in that picture right there, I struggled to get that picture, but there are 3 of them in there. And you can see a little bit of one right there. There's another one over here. And then I think there's a 3rd one in there. And they just would dive under, come up, dive under. And I try to hold the light on them, take the picture, and they're just very difficult to see, depending on, what's happening. But this is where they go. This is where they will lay their eggs. And then they will leave those and migrate back up to their terrestrial habitats. They're kind of slow, and you wonder sometimes, how can these things survive? I mean, they have this very unusual life cycle. They go jump in the water for a while, and they're mating there, and then they disappear under the litter and into the ground the rest of the year. But it turns out they have several really cool adaptations. And so I wanted to mention these. I'm a biologist, I have to mention this stuff. So some of the adaptations, particularly for this guy, the spotted salamander, this is one of the most amazing ones. It turns out the spotted salamander has what might be the only endosymbiotic relationship in a vertebrate. It has a single cell green algae that lives both in the egg case, which you're seeing on the left, but it also gets into the cells of the larvae. And so it's living there. People did not really think that vertebrates could have endosymbiotes, because we have a very powerful immune system that's constantly battling pathogens that are attacking us. And so why isn't it battling this green algae? It doesn't seem to in this case. And the symbiotic relationship apparently is that the algae is producing oxygen, for one thing, in these pools that don't have lots of running water or anything else in them, and probably maybe some sugar because they're photosynthetic. And the spotted salamander, in turn, is producing nitrogen as uric acid wastes, basically, which the algae uses in order to help itself grow. So it's a very interesting relationship, and it seems to be special for this particular mole salamander. So that's one adaptation it has. And the other thing I liked is defense. This is a website that I just pulled up, and it's called Save the Salamanders, STS website. And it's showing 2 of our friends here, the blue spotted and the spotted, and it talks about poisonous amphibians. And it turns out pretty much most salamanders are poisonous. That is, if you eat them, they're not venomous, they don't bite. And they're poisonous as a defense mechanism, of course. It's thought that many of them might be poisonous because of the certain bacteria that they eat, and then they exude these toxins onto their skin. The common bacteria is Vibrio, which is the bacteria that people in the US get sick from eating raw seafood periodically, it's usually this bacteria. I think something like 100 people a year die by eating raw seafood that has Vibrio in it. So anyways, these guys basically exude toxins, probably from this particular bacteria that they consume, and that has individuals, predators, sort of avoid them. So they hide is one thing, but they're also, nobody wants to bite them. So please, if you're going to have a salamander, I guess it should be well cooked. Anyway, so that's one of the defense mechanisms. They're still pretty defenseless. And the other thing that's incredible about salamanders is that they have the most amazing regenerative powers of pretty much any vertebrate. So this is also the same genus. This is the Mexican mole salamander. Turns out it has a different life cycle slightly. It has no terrestrial phase. So it never comes out of the water. It just stays like this. So this is what the larvae of our mole salamanders look like this, sort of, only slightly different colors. And then they metamorphize, become terrestrial, and crawl out. But anyways, all these amphibians have incredible regenerative powers. You can get a tail, a leg, even part of the face can be bitten off, and it will grow back fine. And so I think predators bite these things, they go, yeah, they never eat it again, and then it just grows back. These things are very long-lived. In the wild, our mole salamanders are known to, the oldest, 6, 7, 10 years. It's very difficult to tell in the wild. In captivity, they can grow and live for 20 years. And so they are pretty long-lived critters, and they, even though they're very slow, they seem to have a good way of surviving. So cool animals to be thinking about. So now, since I have only 30 minutes to do this, and I'm probably over time, I'm going to jump into the bog and literally jump into the bog. This is actually not in the bog quite yet. This is the edge of the bog. And what we're going to do is just quickly walk from the edge of the Ponkapog bog, the shore, the upland, into the bog, and just a few slides, and mention the various habitat changes that are there. So what we're looking at right here is basically a red maple swamp. The trees in the background are all red maple. You've got skunk cabbage in the middle of it growing. You've got the number of other shrubby type plants in it. The picture in the bottom right is clefra sweet pepper bush, which is just wonderful smell late in the summer that I love. But there's all sorts of ericaceous things in the heath family, like high bush blueberries and laurels and a number of other things. And so anyways, this is the swamp. And this is the oldest successional area. And then as you walk in, oops, wrong way. As you walk in, this is recently, I went out with Greg Cook, who's a photojournalist, and he took a picture of me falling in it a couple times. This is the boardwalk, and I'm right now at the edge of the Atlantic white cedar successional stage. So everything where towards the camera and where Greg is standing taking this picture is the red maple swamp, and then you're moving into this evergreen Atlantic white cedar area. And as we walk out towards the bog, you can see the bog boardwalk is not in very good shape, and I did fall in. So if you keep walking, then eventually it opens up. So now we're opening up, and the cedar swamp is behind us, and you've got low shrubs. In particular, in here, there's this one ericaceous sort of heath family type shrub, leatherleaf, but there's all sorts of other things. This is Calmia angustifolia sheep's laurel that's flowering right there. And then the key thing that I need to focus everybody on, which is the most, the least conspicuous, is all this stuff here, which is all throughout here, is the sphagnum moss. And sphagnum moss is really, it's been sometimes called an environmental engineer. And it's the thing that makes the bog the bog. Sphagnum moss, there's like 12 different species of sphagnum moss in Ponkapog area. Sphagnum moss, I can't tell any of them apart. So Laura's wrong. She said I knew them all. No, I don't. They all look the same, except they're different colors. You can see different variation with them. Anyways, what they all do is they pump in various ions that they need. But the key thing is they pump out of their cells hydrogen. Hydrogen is what makes things acidic. And so the sphagnum moss turns this area into a very acidic habitat. I don't know, I think somebody told me it's like the acidity of orange juice or maybe something like that. The point of that is, though, the acidity prevents many organisms from decomposing other organisms. And so things do not break down. So the sphagnum moss itself is growing. It seems to be fine with this. It has its sun, it has its water. And then when it dies, it just sort of compresses down, and then more sphagnum moss grows on top and sort of pushes the first layer of sphagnum down, and then more sphagnum and more sphagnum until you get these mats of largely undecomposed, but very brown. I mean, it's brown and it's from the tannic acids that are in there, but it's essentially undecomposed. You can put a core through there and you can pull up tissues that look like sort of little dead leaves. And so this happens year after year, decade after decade, and century after century, creating these very sometimes floating mats. Our bog doesn't sort of create a mound because it's not limited. It's growing out into Ponkapog versus sometimes these kettle bogs tend to get bigger in the middle. We don't have that here, but it's the same kind of activity and habitat. So the point is, sphagnum is changing this. Everything, things cannot get nutrients. And so the organisms that can grow here have to have very special adaptations to be able to grow in a nutrient low environment, water rich, sun rich, but nutrient low. And so those things, and all the species here are adapted to that. But I'm going to talk to you about three. And they're the three that are sometimes the most entertaining. And these three, seen in this picture as one, are the carnivorous plants that live in the bog. There are three different groups of carnivorous plants, and you've probably seen them. This is Sarracenia, pitcher plant. There's something like, I think there's 13, 14 different species in US, but we have just one. Most of them are Southeast United States. There are many other species down there. We have this one. It's a very cool looking plant. What it is a modified leaf. So the leaf is just folded on itself to create that cup. And on top of that, it has other adaptations. So it collects water in that top cup. You can see in the picture here, this comes from a colleague at Harvard, Erin Ellison, who's really done a lot of work on this stuff. And you can see here on the face of this, there are all these tiny hairs and they're all facing downward. So there's water in the side, inside the cup. There's these hairs and it looks like kind of rotting meat, doesn't it? And so it attracts things like meat flies and all sorts of other, and they fall in, they start decomposing, and then they make it smell really bad. So like rotting meat, and that attracts more of their friends. And so it just becomes sort of a cauldron of, disgusting stuff. Interestingly, though, and again, I don't have time to go into much detail, but there's an amazing ecosystem inside these things. This is also a picture from some work from Erin Ellison, but living dangerously inside the cups themselves are organisms, small organisms that have learned to live and adapt to that particular environment. So that there are all sorts of things there that are I wrote down some of them. They're mosquito larvae, there are fly, midge larvae, mites, rotifers, which are kind of worm, various types of nematodes, other kinds of worms, algae, and many types of bacteria. And they're all sort of eating themselves and living in this area. And the plant is just absorbing the nutrients from a lot of that activity. And so pitcher plant has all the nitrogen necessary from all this battling going on inside these little cups. So second one, Sundew. Drosera is the species, is the genus. 16 native species. We have 2 here that I know of. This is one of them. These pictures are from my graduate student. Several of these pictures I've shown are from my grad student, Emmy, who studies these things. She's, I think, vice president of the Carnivorous Plants Society in Massachusetts or something, which I didn't know existed, but it does. This is Sundew. It's totally different, has a different way of capturing bugs. It has these leaves that you see here with these hairs, trichomes sticking out that are sticky. And things land on them. And then you can see there's a little one right there, and it looks like there's a bug there. And these actually move. And so this picture, which was taken by Greg, it's dinner time. And here you can see one of the leaves of Sundew, and there is a little animal right in there. And it has folded on so that more and more of the little sticky trichomes is like touching this poor little thing that's there and slowly digesting it and gaining nutrients, the nitrogens that it can't get from the environment. Oh, look, there's looks like that's a cranberry right there. So there's a lot of little things in this picture. So, but dinner time for Sundew right there. And then the third species that I'm going to mention is this Bladderwart group. And I know I'm running out of time, so I'll try to go quickly. This is probably the most amazing of the carnivorous plants. First of all, it is a cosmopolitan plant. So this strategy has done well for it. It is found on every continent except Antarctica, and different species, but the same genus. There's, as I wrote there, more than 230 species worldwide. We have 12 in Massachusetts, at least. And in Ponkapog, there's several. And I can't tell you exactly how many, but there's at least 4, I think. And the plant is amazing for a number of reasons. Not only does it eat things, and it eats them with these, so this picture is from 1796. So people saw this plant and recognized it as being very unusual back then. It was at one time considered part of the snapdragon family for obvious reasons, has these beautiful flowers, but it's the underwater part that's very cool. And you can see that these little round bladders, not there, these little round bladders are the traps. And I will show you, if we have a second, it's considered the fastest moving plant on the planet. I'll show you a video of that, but you can find them. The other thing that's interesting about this, it's a flowering plant that has no roots. It basically just moves around. You can see in this picture, it shows it's sort of dying. Here's the apex. It's growing off one direction and dying the other direction and just traveling around. And then periodically puts up a flower and does that part. And then just continues sort of swimming underwater, growing one direction, decomposing from the other. There are no roots. There are very few vascular flowering plants that I can think of that have no roots. So it's a really very, very interesting plant. These are some of the ones that we have here. These are mostly pictures. All the flower pictures are from my student, Emmy. And then here's a close-up of some of the bladders that came from the USDA picture. So these are different species. They mostly are yellow flowered, but there are occasionally purple ones. And as I said, in the Ponkapog, right, if you walk to the end of the boardwalk, on the bog, and it's still very acidic there, and you look down and you will see probably something that has this kind of structure, a feathery looking thing underwater. That's it. So it's right there, and there are a number of different species in the pond. So I think I'm getting close. I'm going to show you this rapid plant movement. And then let's see, I'm going to have to unshare for a second. And then I'm going to reshare. And oh dear. Oops. Oh, here it is. Sorry. Surprisingly interesting. One more second. Okay, now share. I think you can see this.
Yes.
It's the bladder. There's a little unsuspecting critter there. It's kind of being slow at the moment. And what's going to happen is it's got a trigger and it gets sucked in. Boop, and it occurs, it's something like 10 milliseconds. That's high speed there, or normal speed. So I think this is slow motion that they're showing you here. So this is like, looks like a Daphne or a little crustacean, and it sort of gets near these bladders, and eventually it hits a little hair trigger, and that basically causes this suction. So that was slow motion. And then this next picture here is, I mean, you can't even see it happen. It's all done. And then it's inside. So I'm going to unshare that. You can find these. They're very cool. I'm going to go back and share to my slideshow again. And my last slide is that one. Questions. So I think I was told I should go about a half an hour, and I think I went about a half an hour. I hope I gave you a little bit of I hope you learned a couple of new things, and it got appreciated some of the unusual critters and their interesting adaptations to survive in these unusual habitats.
Thank you, Rick. We're going to do some questions, some Q&A. We do have some. So thank you so much. And you just affirmed my belief that you could identify anything in nature, but we can agree to disagree on that point.
Yeah.
And I'm still laughing at your impression of an animal taking a bite of a bad tasting salamander. So thank you for all of that information. All right, so here are some questions. I'll start with this one. Could you discuss the impact of climate on the creatures?
That's I actually did plan on that a little bit. So I did I talked last fall about some climate change factors and how they might affect the Blue Hills, and those same things are definitely going to be true. The climate's definitely in New England is getting warmer. It's actually getting wetter also. However, the water is mostly in the winter, and it's not as snow. It's mostly rain. So it's less and less snow here, and more rain. And apparently the prediction is, despite the fact that annually it's been getting wetter, the drought periods in the summer have been getting longer. And so apparently more severe. So we're talking about vernal pools. Two factors there that worry me. One, less snow and ice. Those of you who have gone to see the spotted salamander in a freezing cold night in the end of March, it's often snow on the ground. Sometimes there's even like some ice floating in these little vernal pools. And that's what they like. So what does less snow and longer droughts in the summer due to these vernal pools? I mean, I imagine they're going to dry out faster. I think the fairy shrimp are probably going to be okay because they are known to be able to survive multiple years without water in some of these ponds. So these cysts are really durable, that just the egg cells that are down there are really durable. But I am more concerned about things like the mole salamanders and how the impact on them. The other thing that worries me is as I said also in my last talk, with the climate change, there are vegetation changes. So there are southern populations of species that are moving north, and things that are here are moving out. So for example, the blue spotted salamander, we're pretty much at the southern range of the blue spotted salamander. So that could easily disappear from here, which wouldn't surprise me. It's still north, it's up in Canada and Nova Scotia area. It's very relatively common up there, more common. So we will probably lose things. Maybe the Jefferson salamander might become more common because that seems to be mostly south of us. It's hard to tell how those things are going to change. There's also the last thing that worries me is, and I also mentioned this last fall, is emerging diseases. And particularly for salamanders, there's a fungal pathogen. Well, salamanders and amphibians. You've probably heard of this worldwide fungal or this worldwide decline in frogs and amphibians in general. There's this fungal pathogen, Batrachiotridium dendrobatitis, called BD. And this pathogen, this fungus, basically gets on the skin of these mostly frogs, and it has been lethal in wiping out many, many species across the planet. It's worldwide. There's also a second related fungal pathogen called Bcell that's specific for salamanders. BD is here. Bcell is not. And if Bcell gets here, which people are very worried about, and there are people in my own department who are studying this, it's hard to tell what would happen with that. The one good news from this, it does appear that our amphibians in New England, and in particularly, so Bcell and BD both actually can hit multiple types. Bcell doesn't just hit salamanders, it can hit frogs, and BD also hits all different types of amphibians. But we do know BD is here, and it appears that at least most of our salamanders and seems frogs are somewhat resistant to it. There are some that are not, but I do know a recent study coming out of UMass Boston from a colleague, Doug Woodham's lab, and Brandon, who took some of the neat pictures that you saw here, has shown that spotted salamander tends to be resistant to BD. So whether it's resistant to Bcell, I do not know. Okay, that was a long answer. Sorry. What's the next question?
Thank you, Rick. The next question is, could you comment on how mosquito spraying affects wetland life, larvicides and adulticides? And there are a lot more specific terms, but what's your answer to that?
Well, I don't like the pesticides, but I do understand the issue with mosquitoes. I mean, we have triple E and a number of other pretty serious diseases here. And a lot of these pesticides tend to have residual effects that people don't even know about. So I tend to not like it. I think that I would prefer that we find other strategies which don't include draining wetlands. So that's not the strategy. But in the proper times of the wrong times of the year, obviously covering yourself as needed and whatever is probably the best strategy. But I don't know a lot about the different chemicals involved, so I can't really comment on the side effects that these might have, unfortunately. Okay. Sorry, not a great answer.
No, it's a good answer. Thank you. Here's a question about the sort of our area. How much more marshy was New England before the European settlers?
How much more marshy? I mean, Boston was like a giant marsh, as I believe, and they kind of filled it in. So we have done that environmental engineering ourselves. We've obviously put dams in various places, so floodplains are not as active as they used to, and that was a very important wetland community, and those are less prevalent now. I had, and we obviously we flattened everything for farmland, and so I'm sure we wiped out lots of sort of natural vernal pools, but we do have today old farmland has sort of been reclaimed, and there are certainly wet meadows and marshes that have at least the proper semi-aquatic plant life that I know is pretty indicative of wetlands. And so, some of it's coming back, but it was a very different climate back then. I mean, as you all probably know, that Massachusetts was mostly forested, and then we got down to almost no forest. So that changed I showed one picture of a vernal pool in, something you would see in Blue Hills. Well, those all disappeared, yes. And it probably had a big impact on the species that were there.
Mm. We have a lot of questions about salamanders, but a couple that aren't. So I'm going to ask the ones that aren't about salamanders and bundle the salamander questions together. Someone would like to know when bladderworts flower.
When what flowers?
Bladderworts.
Depends on the species. So there are they for the most part they flower at different times, which is convenient. It's probably an adaptation so that they don't hybridize, because there are multiple species in the Ponkapog area. So I can, if you email me, my email address is rick.kesseli@umb.edu, UMassBoston.edu. I can ask my student, Emmy, who is the complete expert on that, and she knows when every single one of them flowers at the exact time, but they do flower at different times.
Thanks, Rick. All right, the next question is, where would wood frogs find habitat in the Blue Hills?
In the Blue Hills?
Yes.
Well, they find habitat right next to where you live, Laura. So there are wet meadows. I mean, the wood frogs do lay their eggs in these vernal pools. And again, I maybe didn't mention one of the critical things that makes vernal pools special for these critters is that there are no fish. And so there are those 6 species that I mentioned do not make it very well if there is any fish. And so they cannot be in permanent water areas. I kind of dropped all that. I forgot it. Too much to talk about. So, and so there are lots of other visitors and other species that use vernal pools, but these 6 basically don't seem to survive well if there's continuous water and possibility of fish. So anyways, the wood frogs just lay their eggs in these vernal pools because they are protected against fish, although other things eat them. And then they just migrate out into the wet forested areas. So they're in the meadows behind Laura's house. One of the picture that was on the advertising for this is not far. It's right on the edge of the Blue Hills in these wet meadows. So they migrate out into that area and eat every single insect they can find, I guess. And not a very good answer also, but once again, I'll plead innocent here. I am by training a plant biologist, but I like the animals too.
Well, thank you. So I'm going to ask a series of salamander questions because a lot of people are curious. But first, just one person wanted to be sure that salamanders aren't poisonous to the touch, just if you eat them, right?
Yes, in fact, I have several pictures of people holding them. And so, well, let me take that back. If you were to hold a lot of salamanders and then, like touch your face and your eyes and things like that, you might get irritants. I don't think that you would. I think the only people who, well, I don't know anybody who dies from, who eats them. But Vibrio, people do die from Vibrio, that bacteria, and that's thought to be part of the reason they eat these bacteria, part of the reason that they have these toxins, they collect them. But, you have to eat a lot of that. And, but there are toxins on your hands, sure. I wouldn't touch my eyes and touch my face. You could get irritated for sure.
And someone suggests washing your hands after you touch a salamander.
Yes, in the vernal pool if you want.
Yes, okay. All right, here's a question too. I thought some of the salamanders overwintered in the mud of the vernal pools. Your presentation indicates they leave the pools to live in the uplands. Is that correct?
Well, I mentioned the adults. So the adults, they lay their eggs, they go, and they don't generally even feed, I think, in there. The larvae, where they still have their little, gills in there that live in there, they have different strategies. They do live there for a while. They do eat things there, but if they're true vernal pools and they dry up, they tend to start migrating out somewhere also to get protected. I can't say that. I don't know the precise life cycle for all of those species, particularly Jefferson's and the marble one obviously does do what you just said, because they lay the eggs and they're there basically. They lay the eggs in the like September. And then the larvae, basically with the fall rains, they grow and they stay in the vernal pools all winter. Generally, they like the vernal pools there that have some ice, but that aren't frozen all the way solid. So anyway, so yes, they are there. Those are there. Sure.
All right. All right. Are the redback salamanders not aquatic?
Redback, they're interesting. I was told once that the highest animal biomass in any forest is the redback salamander. There's so many of them. And they, let me see, what is their exact life cycle? I can't tell you. I don't know for sure. They certainly have an aquatic stage. Because they're amphibians. That's, part of the game. But how much of their time they spend in water, and in particular when they still got gills, I can't tell you. I don't really know.
All right, thank you.
Sorry, bad answer again.
Are salamanders cold-blooded?
Yes. So I guess that's the common term. Their body temperature fluctuates drastically with the environment, unlike ours. Your temperature is pretty much, unless you're sick, 90. Well, these days you probably all know your temperature. Every time I go into various places, somebody's shooting a little beam on me, and it's always, for me, it's always 97.5 or something. It's under 98.6. But anyways, it's pretty stable. Their temperatures, their body temperatures change drastically. So that's generally what people call cold-blooded. Yes.
All right. Thanks. What is the range of salamanders? They are, as you know, protected by a 100-foot buffer zone around wetlands. Do they travel further than that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, some of these salamanders, they migrate. I've heard they migrate up to a half a mile away, 500 meters or so. It depends probably on them. It depends on how quickly they find good habitat. They do migrate. Yes, all of at least 3 of those, except for spotted, the one in the picture here, the other 3 are all considered threatened or of special concern in Massachusetts. They're much rarer. This one is not, I don't think it's considered threatened at the moment. One in this picture.
All right, thanks. All right, now here's there's some variety of questions again. How would you explain the difference between autumnal pools and vernal pools?
What was the first kind?
Autumnal, as in autumn.
Oh,
is there?
Autumn pools?
Yeah.
Well, one's full in the spring and one's full in the autumn. In the fall, vernal pools tend to be, it doesn't mean that they just have water in the spring. I mean, the first picture I showed you, that California pool that I worked on many, many years ago. I mean, California has that famous Mediterranean climate. It does not rain from October, it does not rain from end of May to October, ever. Nothing, not a drop. And so they all do dry out. And so they are really very vernal springtime pools. Here, you know our rain patterns. Water can accumulate at any time of the year here. And we have, April showers, bring May flowers. We have a lot of rain in the springtime, but we also get a lot of rain in the fall. Maybe a tangent from that question. I mean, I mentioned to you, so that water, that rain in the pools there does not alter, as far as I know, the life strategies, the life cycles of these mole salamanders. They don't like come out all of a sudden in the fall because it's all of a sudden full in the pools. On the other hand, I really do wonder about the fairy shrimp. I mean, they have such a short life cycle. I wonder, and normally they hatch from these little diapause cyst eggs that have been laid from the season before. They hatch in Marchish, maybe a little earlier, and they're dead by May. So I wonder what happens I wonder if there's some potential. They have such a short life cycle. They could presumably reemerge maybe at a different time of the year. I just don't know. So I don't know.
Thank you. These two comments, one's a comment, one's a question, are related. One listener says, I noticed spring peepers were very loud in some of the vernal pools last month. And then another listener asks, what are the critters in vernal pools that make all the noise in early spring? Some in the daytime, some others at night. Do these salamanders make noise?
As far as I know, the salamanders are not very noisy. But there are lots of different frog species, that use the pools. So the wood frog is not the only frog species that use the pools. And I have some pictures of green frogs and others, and peepers, and they are certainly noisy. So I don't know that salamanders talk much. But I'll ask my salamander experts. As I mentioned, Doug Woodhams, who's a faculty member at UMass Boston, and he works on salamanders. And I will ask him and his students, do they ever say anything? I don't know the answer. Well, this one's saying questions, but they're very quiet. So
Great.
peepers, definitely frogs. There's all sorts of other critters probably out there. When I was out at the vernal pools that I was visiting this spring, I heard lots of sounds. I can never tell where they're coming from because I only hear one direction. My hearing is kind of bad. So I can never find those sounds where they're coming from, but they're there.
All right, you're getting there, Rick. We only have 3 more questions.
Okay.
When is the best time to see the plants we talked about?
You can see it's very difficult, right? 2 weeks ago, when I went out with Greg Cook, I had a very hard time finding Sundew. So it had barely not germinated yet. So that's the one with the sticky leaves, and it's very small. I could not find very many or any. I found one little tiny one starting to germinate. So it's too early for that. We did find quite a few pitcher plants, and I found Utricularias there all the time in the water. The Bladderwart is in the water. I mean, it's not flowering now. So you get to the end of the boardwalk, you look down there and you see there's these underwater aquatic things. And this is one of several, but it's the one that's not rooted, and it has the bladders. It's pretty obvious when you see it. The bladders are very obvious. So that's there, but it's not flowering. The pitcher plants can definitely be seen now, and they were greening up pretty well, new tissue growing, but the sundew is too early. I think you probably wait another month and you could see the sundew's fine. And the pitcher plants will flower. I did show a picture there that wasn't mine right there. It's flowering. They have a really bizarre flower, and they flower late summer-ish. And they're really cool looking when they flower. You look at the flower, you say, it's hard to tell that's a flower. The structure doesn't look reminiscent of any standard flower that you're used to.
All right, thank you. They are beautiful and exquisite.
Yeah, this
really.
is Aaron Allison's picture, not mine, but it's a beautiful picture, and they are in beautiful flower. It came from one of his publications.
Wonderful. Someone is asking, this relates a little bit to the pesticides, but wondering if the BT mosquito dunks are harmful.
Whether the
Little
BT, the
mosquito
bacteria.
dunks. Yeah.
Okay. Is it harmful to who? Us or the mosquitoes?
I don't know, probably the creatures, but.
This is a bacteria. As many of you know, it's Bacillus is the genus, and they basically make toxins that kill insects and allow them to decompose those insects. And so it's a common, people use Bt dust, the bacteria, on organic farms. And so I am actually, it does not hurt us in any way, as far as I know at all. I mean, what I do not like, and I'm also, born, Laura mentioned I did my graduate work at University of California, Davis, and we are the Aggies. And so the Aggies are very interested in agricultural issues. And the one thing I really do not like is genetically introducing Bt toxin into plants like soybean, not because it would hurt you, but because it sort of takes away the ability to do integrated pest management. I mean, the best way to do pest management, just like anything, like managing bacterial infections with antibiotics, is that you don't take them all the time. You use them when you need them, and you use the right one when you need it. If you introduce it into the plants, this is my, I'm not against GMOs. I'm against this particular aspect of using this technology, because it really does, insects gain resistance to things quickly. And so if you introduce it into plants, then, and not, instead of just use it at the time when you need it, then you're just going to be creating speeding up the evolution of insect resistance to this, and then it'll become useless. So I think that will affect organic farmers, and it'll affect all sorts of other individuals. And then, the people who, some of the big agro businesses think that they can come up with new versions of Bt. And there are many different versions of this that can be used for specific insects. I don't think it hurts us. On the other hand, they should do the test to find out if it impacts other insects and is not very specific. And that has been the case in some cases. So long answer again. I do not mind Bt. And so spraying it for a specific particular case, I think, is probably a fine thing to do for the most part, especially if it's a very serious disease. You would want to look to make sure that there's not too many other target species, potentially. But anyways.
All right. Here's one more big question, and then we have a sort of a funny question, and then we're going to say thank you and goodbye and good night.
Okay.
But someone is wondering, what do you think of trying to artificially revitalize an area that used to be a vernal pond?
Oh, well, people do that. There's a lot of effort to recapture natural habitats, reclaim those. There's, the cranberry bogs in southeastern Massachusetts. Their cranberry business is sort of moved out, and it's possible we can get those back to really more natural habitats. And so these things, people do this. It's a slow process. I think some of the the companies that do this for a living, I think they don't follow up on it very well. I can think of a couple of cases of restoration along the Neponset River that was required because certain businesses, when they were trying to clean up the river and also make the bike path, sort of had damaged things. And they hired some companies that came in and planted some, well, let's see, Ammophila, which is the dune grass, and some other things. And then they left, and pretty much most of it died, and they didn't care. They put it in and they left. So it is not something that you can just drop something in there and then it makes it, it takes time to get these habitats back to normal. But I think we need to stop losing habitat, because you can't just take, even if you do restoration and create some new vernal pools and things like that, you still have to, there's only a limited amount of space for that stuff. And final thing I'll mention, in California, they were actually doing just that, recreating some of those vernal pool type things that I showed you in the very first picture. So, I mean, there are lots of efforts to try to recreate some of these endangered habitats.
All right. So Rick, if you go to your last slide, the one about questions, we have a fun tongue-in-cheek question for you. And this will be the final question before we thank you and say goodnight. In your last photo, is that the tongue of the salamander?
Oh, no, I don't think so. Oh, I see that.
You see that? Yeah. Yeah.
I don't believe so. I think that's the stem of the oak leaf there. I never noticed it before. Yeah, I don't think so, but maybe he's sticking his tongue out at me. I will, I'll ask my salamander friends. It does look a little weird though, doesn't it?
Maybe it's eating something.
I could be. My student Emmy took this picture too. But I doubt she knows that if it was eating anything, or maybe this one was this one was Brandon. Anyways, these are graduate students at UMass who work on these critters. I will ask that. I don't think so, but that's a really good point.
Well, they're very lucky, those students, to work with you, Rick. So a big thank you. Really, this was fascinating. These plants and animals are exquisite. Thank you so much to everybody who listened in this evening. Thank you so much, Rick, for your work preparing this presentation for all of us.
Okay.
And have a wonderful evening, everybody. Thank you.
I see somebody said it's definitely a stem. My neighbor said it's definitely a stem. Yeah, I think so.